Opening in the late 1880s, Erickson's Saloon on Burnside Street between 2nd and 3rd was a mecca of Portland, Oregon. Despite being at the epicenter of the city's Skid Row, Erickson's was considered, at least by some, to be the most lavish saloon on the West Coast. A free lunch program kept local transients fed, and when the greatest flood to ever hit Portland struck in 1894, proprietor August Erickson brought a barge down Burnside Street and served drinks from there. But the grandeur came to an end on a cold winter morning in late 1912, when Erickson's was destroyed by a fire started in a neighboring pawn shop. Undeterred by this tragic loss, a new Erickson's was built just off Burnside on 2nd Avenue. Like the original, it was 3 stories tall with the saloon on the ground floor and rooming quarters on the upper floors. Unfortunately, the general structure of this place was not the only thing this new Erickson's building would share with the original. When the new Erickson's was built, which still stands on 2nd Avenue, the upper floors were dubbed the Pomona Hotel. It was a combination hotel and place for drunks down in the saloon to sleep things off. Like most hotels and rooming houses in that Skid Row area, the Pomona was a modest place that would become more modest over time. By the middle 20th century, Skid Row was a haven of transients and alcoholics, many of them living in the less than $100 a month hotels and flop houses of that area. To accommodate a lot of those who cared little for their accommodations, some of these places were transformed into what were called chicken coop hotels. These places were transformed into rooms usually 6 feet by 6 feet, often compared to cubicles. They often had little more than a hanging light and a cot to sleep on. Chicken wire would be hung over the walls to keep tenants from throwing things into the other, quote, units. This here is the walk-in closet in my less than 600 square foot apartment. It's just literally just the closet. Stuff here, stuff here. It's a closet. I found that this room, if you can call it that, is a little bit more than 5 feet by 5 feet, which means the square footage in this closet is about 26 feet. Some of these coops, cubicles, whatever you want to call them, were at most 6 feet by 6 feet, 36 square feet. This walk-in closet is almost 3/4 the size of a lot of these units that were in some of these hotels down on Skid Row. The most well-known of these was the Home Hotel at 2nd and Burnside, also regarded in newspapers as the city's last great flophouse. A block down on 3rd was a similar joint, the Home Hotel. Today, it's Voodoo Donuts' flagship store. By the 1970s, the Pomona had also become one of these flop houses, consisting of small cubicles with little more than a light and a cot to sleep on. Its tenants almost exclusively middle-aged alcoholic men. But it was still their home. To no surprise, Most places like these were not up to code. Many lacked a sprinkler system or a properly functioning fire alarm in case a fire took place. The Pomona, in particular, did not have a sprinkler system. By the summer of 1975, the place was essentially an 80-cent a night black hole. Harold McCaskey, 69, a resident at the Pomona, was in his room when he detected an odor in the air. He came to his feet and went to check out the window of his room when suddenly he was stormed by firefighters who quickly led him out the window and to safety on the streets below. He would be one of the lucky ones, and he'd later say he felt something was going to happen that night. A few units down, Russell King was fast asleep when he was awakened to his room engulfed in smoke. Coughing and struggling to his door, he opened it to see flames all over the hallway and no way of escape. He quickly pulled the door shut, but was, for the moment, trapped. Just then, the window to his room was thrown open, and firefighters on a ladder helped lead him out of the room before succumbing to the smoke. Thomas White, another resident, made it to safety when his dog woke him up by pulling his covers off. Little did any of these men realize, until the last moment, what had happened. A fire had broken out on the second floor stair landing above the saloon space, effectively blocking the stairwell down to the first floor. This kept all the tenants on the second and third floors trapped up there, all at the mercy of the expanding conflagration. Robert Harris, a local contractor, was having dinner in the area. After stepping outside, he recalled it being stunningly quiet when he looked up and saw smoke billowing from the building. He quickly called 911, the call going through at 11:01 p.m. Harris then did everything a good hero could. After placing his call, he saw several men hanging out the windows of their rooms, and he begged them not to jump and that the fire department was coming. He pulled the fire escape ladder down and tried to storm the building, but was rebuffed by the flames. He witnessed one man try and escape that way, being overcome and collapsing. Harris helped pull him to safety, still alive, but he would die later at the hospital. Harris also helped emergency personnel in administering CPR. Due to the fact that so many were trapped in the building, the focus was made to save as many as possible before focusing on putting the fire out. It was absolute chaos, with several men hanging out their windows because there was nowhere else to go. One woman appeared to linger, completely still in a window, before being pulled, nude, from her window at the last second. There were many other unnamed heroes that night. While the outside world saw many Skid Row inhabitants as lost and demoralized drunks, the fact of the matter was that these hotel residents were still human beings. Orville Kindon, 55, recalled stumbling around a dark and smoky hallway and going weak, falling to his knees, when two men passing by stopped to help drag him out of the building, saving his life. Another resident, Johnson James, 69, noted he was disabled at the hips and would have died had others in the hotel not helped carry him out. But unfortunately, while some clung to their windows or escaped to safety, others either panicked or felt they had no choice but to escape a different way. This only other way was to go out in the hallway and hopefully find a way down to the first floor. When the fire, which ultimately did minimal damage considering what could have happened, was finally extinguished, several of these men were found dead on the third floor hallway. They'd clearly been trapped and overwhelmed by the smoke. The third floor did not have a fire door, keeping the flames and smoke trapped there. The flames were said to burn so hot in that hallway that one breath could have meant instant death. The sidewalks along 2nd Avenue in the aftermath was a gut-wrenching sight, as the deceased were removed from the building and placed there along with those who had managed to escape. Many noted that it was hard to tell who was alive and who was dead, and many of the survivors had still suffered from smoke inhalation. Harold McCaskey recalled seeing the bodies of the dead on the sidewalks with blankets placed over them. He was quoted to say, "They were good boys, and now they're gone." Initially, it was reported that 8 men had died as a result of the fire. However, several men were in rough shape due to the exposure to the fire. Again, many of them were older and suffered from alcoholism. Ultimately, 4 more men would die, bringing the total number of victims to 12, with the last man, 46-year-old William Highsmith, not passing until October of 1975. In addition to these deaths, it was reported as many as 26 others had suffered injuries in the fire, including several firefighters. Of the 8 men who died during the fire, only 7 of them would be identified, as one was burnt beyond recognition. There's something of a great tragedy to be said about a forgotten man wasting away in a Skid Row hotel, who was so abandoned by the world that even in death, he lost his identity. The 7 who were ID'd included the following: Virgil Charles Howard, 57. Born in 1928, he served in both World War II and in Korea. He was reported by some as the first victim to be identified. The second to be identified was Jim Jimenez, 57, who, out of all the victims, I could find no background information about. Herman Martinez, 44, another victim found in the third floor hallway. Jose Hernandez, 47, born in 1930 in Texas, he also lived in and had a family in Arizona. Herman Bailey, 30, the youngest of the dead, was the only victim who actually grew up in Oregon. I'm pretty sure this is a picture of him while attending high school in the 1940s, just west of Portland. Narcissus Bearley, 57, a Native American born in 1917. He spent much of his life in Montana. He also served in the Army in World War II. Claude Maple, 69. Born in 1905 in Oklahoma, he mostly worked as a laborer, working a time in the oil fields of Texas. Several of the victims appeared in previous censuses as laborers in other states, leading me to think they came to Portland as transient laborers, a common type of man to end up stranded in Portland's Skid Row. The first victim to die after the fire was Carl Hunsaker, 62. He died on July 9th due to the burns he'd received. 4 days later, July 13th, Keith Millsap, 60, passed away due to a combination of smoke inhalation and the burns he had received. He was also originally from Oklahoma. He was reportedly married at the time of the fire, and yet he was living alone at the Pomona. Robert Platero, 49, succumbed to his injuries on July 15th. Born in New Mexico, he was also a World War II veteran. And then there was William Highsmith, 46, the last one to pass away in October. He may have had the most interesting life of all the victims. He'd been left on the doorstep of a church as an infant, ultimately adopted, but never knowing his biological parents. He had a small criminal record, where I was able to obtain a picture of him, unlike the others. He also served in the Army, moving to Portland in 1965, where he, oddly enough, worked for a time as a hotel manager. These were men so easily forgotten, and yet they suffered a death no one should ever experience. And they were victims of the greatest hotel fire tragedy, not just in the history of Portland, but in the history of Oregon. And with the Pomona's reputation as a Skid Row flophouse, it was easy to presume this fire was the result of negligence on the part of the hotel's proprietors, or even its tenants. The hotel was in the process of getting up to code, but it hadn't completed this process yet when the fire happened. This process was started by prominent local developer Bill Nadeau, who'd recently purchased the building. It must have been an old frayed wire or a resident falling asleep with a lit cigarette. But when the aftermath of the fire was investigated, its place of origin was established at the top of the stairwell on the second floor. An accelerant had been placed there to help the fire spread quick, in a spot that strategically blocked any easy escape down to the first floor and out of the building. This was not an accident. It was arson. It was murder. Someone had recklessly set the stage to kill 12 men. The accelerant in question was found to be gasoline. There were multiple reports of a gas can found near the hotel, recovered by police and taken to be checked for prints. This is a detail that was conveniently forgotten over time. It was learned from a Chevron gas station attendant, Stephen Robertson, that at approximately 10:35 p.m., less than 30 minutes before the fire started, an older man, possibly in his 70s, paid his station a visit. This man put down $5 to buy 50 cents of gas and put a deposit down on a gas can to carry it. This station was reportedly just around the corner from the Pomona, while I never found an exact location. If I had to guess, I know a gas station has been located on Burnside, between 4th and 5th Avenues for a long time. and I have found no evidence of any other stations closer to the Pomona than that. Needless to say, authorities wanted to find out who this man was. Shortly after the fire, a man, John Joseph Newvine, 61, was arrested 2 blocks from the Pomona. He was a Skid Row regular who lived at another flophouse-style spot called the Pomona Hotel, which, again, is the future site of Voodoo Donuts. Back in 1975, it was a $36 a month hotel for some of Portland's most drunken residents. A World War II vet, like some of the victims, Newvine also worked many years as a laborer. He had been through detox 22 times and was known to be a quiet outcast with no friends. His hotel manager, Bud Harvey, would further elaborate on his demeanor, saying that when he was sober, he'd sit for hours and not talk to anyone. Other times he'd just stand up, then sit down and stand up again, a very nervous type. He would sit in front of the television and stare at it without even turning it on. He was definitely a lost and disturbed man, and he reportedly matched close with the description given by Stephen Robertson for the man that he saw. The last time Harvey saw Newvine, the night of the fire, was about 2 hours before it happened. Newvine was at the home in a deep and quiet state of inebriation. For a brief moment, authorities felt they had their man. For whatever reason, behind his quiet and distant demeanor, Newvine had an element of firebug to him. Then, Stephen Robertson, who'd initially said that Newvine was the man who put down the deposit at his station, changed his mind and said he made a mistake. Newvine was not the man he saw. In the aftermath of this revelation, Newvine was released shortly after, due to a lack of evidence. The reason for all of this was, to Stephen Robertson's potential surprise, the man who'd put down the deposit actually returned to his station on July 10th to collect that deposit. This man was 57-year-old Roy Jennings Beard, and to no surprise, the police were quick to track him down and arrest him, not for arson, but on a charge of drunkenness. If anything, Beard was a heavier drinker than even John Newvine. He grew up in Indiana, where he was born in 1918, and he was yet another World War II veteran. And I almost wonder, while alcoholism can come from any number of things, I really wonder if potentially their experiences in the war, both Beard and Newvine, may have had an effect on why they had gone down the roads that they'd gone. But unlike Newvine, Beard's circumstances in 1975 were more mysterious. He was a transient without a primary address. He did have a criminal history, including multiple charges of drunkenness, vagrancy, and even providing alcohol to a minor while he lived in other parts of Oregon, such as Albany and Brownsville. While being held on the drunken charge, police analyzed their situation with Beard, and it was quickly deemed he was their strongest suspect. After being released on the drunken charge, he was then immediately re-arrested on a charge of reckless homicide related to the Pomona fire. As the case against him began, Beard was quickly sent to the state hospital in Salem to establish whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. He would be analyzed by a Dr. Glenn D. Fraser, who then put out a report on his findings. This report painted a tragic representation of how dark Skid Row life could be. Dr. Fraser reached the conclusion that Beard had imbibed so much alcohol and deprived himself of essential vitamins and nutrients that he had sustained brain damage. He was aware of the charges against him, but he was still confused about them. Dr. Fraser also expressed doubt that Beard's state would improve. This led to a halt on a trial that was planned to start at the end of summer of 1975. It appears Beard remained at the state hospital while he was unfit to stand trial, but in 1978, it was reported that his condition had improved and that a trial might finally happen. However, while the plan was to reevaluate his competency, there's no evidence this ever happened. By 1980, likely in a rapidly deteriorating state, Beard was released into hospice care back into his home state of Indiana, making it clear he would never stand trial for the Pomona Hotel fire. Only months after going back to Indiana, in December 1980, Roy Jennings Beard passed away. John Newvine would pass away in March of 1979. Historically speaking, Roy Jennings Beard has always been generally regarded as the man who set the fire at the Pomona. But he was never tried. The evidence against him was never presented in a court of law, and Sergeant Tom Potter, future Portland mayor, would claim that there was extensive evidence pointing to Beard's guilt, without actually saying he 100% did it. Portland fire investigator Dante Petruzzelli would make the claim in 1982 that Beard was the arsonist in this case, and that his motive for the crime stemmed from a beef he'd taken up with one of the men who lived there. Alas, as far as the layman knows, these are just claims. It appears the strongest element of guilt in Beard's case is that he was the customer at the Chevron station, buying gas shortly before the fire. It was the sole event that led to his abrupt arrest by police. But despite the convenient timing of this fact does not prove his guilt in the fire. It doesn't put him in the Pomona. It's strong circumstantial evidence, sure, but that's all it is. And again, whatever happened to this can that was found near the hotel that was taken in by law enforcement to be checked for prints? If this can was used to pour the gas inside the hotel, and Roy Jennings Beard brought the can he had back to the Chevron station to collect his deposit, then it suggests the likelihood of somebody else being responsible for the fire, whoever ditched that gas can near the Pomona. And Roy Beard was barely functional. In addition to being brain damaged, he was ceaselessly drunk and without a home. And yet this man had $5 burning a hole in his pocket, which he then used for a deposit instead of buying more booze or finding a place to stay for a few nights. In his normal state, it would have been difficult for Beard to just find the Pomona Hotel, and yet this fire does not appear to be the work of an amateur or someone with a deeply fractured constitution, with the origin point being the stairs leading down from the second to the first floor. It implies pre-planning and a background on the makeup of that building. They knew setting the fire here would trap everyone on the second and third floors. This was not an act of drunken revenge. This was a cold-blooded act with the intent of endangering many lives. At least that's how I see it. Perhaps the evidence against Beard is stronger than we know, and I'm not claiming he could not have been the perpetrator in the case. There's just some unanswered questions and several aspects of the case that leave me scratching my head. It does leave one wondering why someone would intentionally try and kill so many already forgotten men. If this fire were a case of someone trying to get rid of what they deem to be lesser humans, it wouldn't be the first time. The Pomona Hotel fire not only shed a bright light on the plight of those living in the area, many of whom were staying in places much worse, but led to code changes in Portland in relation to fire safety. The most unfortunate aspect of the case, and a significant factor in the many deaths that occurred, was the fact that there was no fire door on the third floor. Portland City Council mandated in 1972 that all of its hotels had to put in fire doors and gave them the deadline of April 1974 to comply. However, this deadline was then extended into 1976. At the time of its fire, the Pomona had yet to put in those doors, and this extension sadly made that possible. Several inspections of the hotel before the fire revealed several other deficiencies, but with the hotel in the process of coming up to code like everyone else, they likely were given a pass on these issues. Today, the building, still historically known as the Old Erickson Saloon, is low-cost housing. There have been numerous changes to its interior since 1975, and yet there are still a few reminders of that fire, left in plain sight. And it's still technically unsolved, even in a legal sense, seeing as Roy Beard was never tried or convicted of the crime. And with law enforcement's certainty that whoever put that deposit down at the gas station was the arsonist, no other suspects were sought, looked into, or pursued. While the city should have noted this event as a tragic consequence in regards to their giving so much leniency in forcing places to come up to code, the city instead chose to do what one would probably expect: put the pressure on these rundown places and use that force that city governments seldom use until after a tragedy has already taken place. They gave upwards of 200 buildings in the city that were not up to code until the start of 1976 to fix that. Of course, many rundown hotels in town were placed in danger of closure, leaving many of their flat-broke tenants with nowhere to go. And many of the owners, and tenants for that matter, fought back, daring the city to take them to court. One of the spots in danger at this time was the old Lotus that once stood at 3rd and Salmon. A 79-year-old resident there, Antonio Zanardi, noted conditions there were fine and that he, both elderly and in poor health, had nowhere else to go. The whole thing was a quagmire. Addressing this complicated matter, Doug Seeley of Portland's Building Bureau said, "Do you throw people out in the street and let them freeze to death? Or do you let them burn?" It seems for the most part that the city remained somewhat laxed on the matter of seeing to it that these rundown hotels did get up to code. Only a few years later, 1980, Carl Cornell fell asleep smoking a cigarette in his room at the Home Hotel, a spot again across Burnside from Erickson's and the one-time Pomona Hotel. Cornell himself would be the only death in the fire, but had this fire been an arson, accelerated by gasoline, this fire could have been even worse than that of the Pomona. The aftermath was chaotic, with many of the hotel's tenants being older, alcoholic men. One of them was quoted in papers as simply saying, "I was drunk. I don't know what happened." Gene Rivers, who worked at the county's detoxification center at the time, noted it was a miracle more didn't die, as the Home Hotel, like the Pomona, did not have sprinkler systems or fire doors. After this fire, it appears the building was closed down for quite a while, as a small arson fire in the building in 1986 occurred while the building was reportedly still vacant. Over time, many of the worst of these hotels have either been demolished, left vacant, or converted into low-income housing. Certainly there's always going to be residential buildings violating codes of some kind, but it's unfortunate that it appears so little was ultimately done in the aftermath of the Pomona Hotel fire to logically enforce code compliance and to try and better the conditions of where these lost souls were forced to live. Then again, that's city government for you. Even as late as 2010, the former Grove Hotel at 4th and Burnside was purchased by the city when the state of this contemporary flophouse was discovered. The 21st century, and this place was in worse shape than places like the Pomona and the Home could ever pray to be, filled with trash, rats and bugs everywhere, some tenants suffering infections from bedbug bites. The building also had no operating sprinkler system and a non-functioning fire alarm. It was abundantly clear that had a fire broken out in this building, it would have been deadly. Some things just never change, especially when it comes to those humans the world chooses to forget.